Welcome, everyone. We are just waiting for people to come into the room, and we're really excited to have you here. Just going to wait a couple more minutes. All right, everyone, welcome to the celebration of David's book launch, Stop Blaming Mothers and Ignoring Fathers: How to Transform the Way That We Keep Children Safe from Domestic Violence. And I'm really, really excited that you're here. I'm very, very, very excited that we have gotten to the place where the book is published and that we have launched it. And this has been an amazing journey. And I'm really honored and grateful to be able to interview David for this book launch and hear about his process and hear about the hopes that he has for this book, and how it will impact the field and how it will change the way that we do business and how we keep children safe from domestic violence. So, hi, David.
Hi, Ruth. How are you? We're normally doing a podcast when we have these conversations, so this is kind of fun.
We are in different spaces. Usually when we do the podcast, we're in the same space. Um, but this is David's first book, and it was quite a journey. As you can probably see, it's a pretty hefty book. It took a lot of dedication and David getting up every morning at 6 o'clock in the morning and starting to write every morning, and just a lot of discipline for that to happen. And all while being the CEO of the Safe and Together Institute, all while being a present and wonderful partner and father and friend to so many people. And so I personally am really happy that we're at this place, and I'm really proud of you, David.
Thank
You did an amazing job.
you.
Um, so we're gonna hear from David about why he wrote the book, absolutely for sure. And he's gonna read some excerpts from the book itself. And we'll take some questions at the end of the book launch event from people. So if you have questions, please make sure to pop them in the chat. And then, we're also going to talk about at the end some thoughts about how you can support the book's impact, how you can extend the impact of the book by your own, practice, your own reading, your own internalizing of the information in the book. But first, I'm going to ask David a couple of questions as we go through. And I'm just going to point out as we go through some of the the awards already that David is starting to get, and the ratings for the book on different platforms. And as you see up on this first slide, that it is already number one release in domestic violence relations and family law, number one release in child abuse, and number one release in social work, and the bestseller in domestic and partner abuse. And this was a new one. This is kind of a fun one that we just saw yesterday. This is Coercive Control Chat out of the UK magazine. And though it's February, they've already named the book of the year. So with that, David, why did you write this book?
Thanks, Ruth. It's great to have everybody here to celebrate the launch of this book, and it's already been doing really well out the chute. Hundreds have been sold already. I'm really excited about more being sold. I wrote the book because I really wanted to share more about the Safer Together model, but even maybe more importantly, the thinking behind the model. The model was really a response to problems in the field, problems in practice, problems in the way systems responded, struggles of practitioners, and really wanted to share, some of the thinking behind the model and create a book that was not only going to be an introduction for some people to the thinking behind the model and the model itself, but really be something that can be used by, we have hundreds of certified traders globally. We have partner agencies. We have jurisdictions we've been working with heavily across the globe. Wanted it to really be something that they could dive into, folks who were experienced with the model. So it's really for kind of newcomers. It's really for experienced people with the model. And it's actually something that I really hoped would validate the experience of survivors. And I'm really pleased that I'm already getting feedback from survivors who are reading the book that it's very validating. I'm getting screenshots from some survivors on LinkedIn who are saying, I read this and this really reflected my experience, and thank you for writing this. And as I always say, that some of the most important feedback I ever get on the model and the work we do is from survivors who are really, in essence, the end users of the model. And so I wanted something, Ruth, for everybody. And that really reflected this sort of broad look at different sectors in the common language that the model really reflects in its day-to-day work.
Now, I'm going to deviate from the questions you gave me.
Sure you are.
And you kind of answered the question about who is this audience? Who's the audience? So you
Right.
talked about that it's for different sectors. It's also for survivors to validate their experience of their, engagement with professionals and the ways that they're failing or they're slipping through the cracks or the silos. But I think really importantly, the book is set up in a myth structure.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to talk a little bit about how you set up that myth structure and what addressing those myths is meant to do?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. One is just to say that coming to that was surprising to me. And for those of you who've written books before, right before that starting from a blank piece of paper can be really daunting. And this isn't my first attempt at writing a book about the model. This is actually my second. About 7 or 8 years ago, I wrote about 100,000 words and then just tossed them overboard. Wasn't happy. And so came back around about 3 years ago to the idea of writing again, and really kind of sat down, started sketching out some notes. Had a great assistant on this project, Deb Nicholson, who some of you know, kind of helping me kind of ideate it and think about it and be creative and then kind of project manage the whole process. And I really tried to think about how do I communicate the language of gaps in the system and the system's response, and the way practitioners and systems may be out of alignment with the lived experience of survivors and out of alignment with their own needs. And I'd always kind of avoided a myths and facts educational framework. In fact, that was when I came up in the field. That was so common. People talk about myths and facts around domestic violence. Myth would be, domestic violence only happens in poor communities, and it'd be sort of, no, it happens across all socioeconomic areas. And I always found that a little bit, while useful, not useful to help practitioners. And so I kind of started thinking about, in each sector, there would be a dominant myth. So for instance, the myth of perpetrator accountability, right? That's one of the chapters. And so that chapter really looks at how we've really defined that definition of perpetrator accountability poorly, very unevenly, and very incompletely. So it's been very much focused on perpetrators as criminal offenders, not as fathers. So what that means is, in the realm of practice around child protection and family court, for instance, there hasn't been an investment in kind of articulating what accountability means for perpetrators in the context of their children's lives and in terms of co-parenting. And that's really failed families, that gap. So that the myth there is, and all the way through, the myth of perpetrator accountability is what's this idea that's outside, where kind of we have these ideas that kind of take on the life of their own, but they're really out of alignment with a lived experience of survivors and practitioners. So that myth of perpetrator accountability, myth of the child witness, again, the language of child witness and domestic violence is, kids do see domestic violence. They do experience, and they are traumatized by often what they see. And that concept is so dominant, at the same time, it's incomplete in terms of telling the story of how kids are impacted by perpetrators' behavior. So that's, those are two of the chapters and two of the ideas about sort of why the myth structure was. I wanted something that was easy for people to understand, that could work across these different dominant ideas, whether it's child witness, whether it's the myth of trauma-informed practice, which again, I hope I do a good job of the book saying, I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Trauma-informed practice is so important, but it's not the same as domestic violence informed practice. The trauma lens does not capture lots of things related to coercive control, for instance. So I'm really trying to help people advance and kind of engage with these very important kind of ideas, but really in a critical and practical way. That's the goal of that myth structure.
Right. And I love how the myth structure draws people back to the behavioral aspects of domestic violence, because many of the myths that you address talk about these frameworks, whether they be mental health frameworks or legal frameworks, that actually don't address the behavioral realities and the impact to the overall family. So I love the myth structure, the myth busting itself is a wonderful tool. Um, so, I just threw up another slide here, and this is a review by Evan Stark. A lot of you in the room may be familiar with Evan's work. And you and Evan kind of work in parallel with each other with different concepts around children and domestic violence. So, we're really honored that he read the book and gave us this review. Um, I would be curious to know how the book, which is not a Safe and Together training book, it really truly doesn't teach people how to do Safe and Together work within their professional practice. But how does this book land in the wider framework of the Safe and Together model?
You're right. It's not a how-to book on one level. It's not a like manual for training, but it does anchor each myth chapter is anchored in the model. Each myth chapter kind of talks about the problem of the myth, and then kind of how the model is a corrective around the myth. So it is very intimately tied to the model, and so it is a kind of it is explaining the connection of the model to the field in a deeper way, more than that would get covered in the training, to be honest. So it's a complement to the training we do. So we're going to figure out how to get it out there related to trainings, but I really encourage anybody who's not to assume that they've done the training or taken our courses they know what's in the book. The book has so much more in it and will really deepen your understanding. The book also has data on the model's effectiveness, including interviews with practitioners and survivors, which I really felt like the book could not succeed in its mission of communicating what I wanted to communicate without fresh interviews we did with practitioners using the model, because the practitioners are the champions. The practitioners bring it alive. And many of you are on the call. And so I would say the model is just words on a piece of paper until people champion it in the lives of their practice and the lives of their clients. And so so we had voices of practitioners all over the globe commenting, whether they were in family court or they were child and family agencies or substance abuse programs or work with survivors directly, advocate work. So there's a whole section on that, and there's quotes sprinkled throughout the book from those folks. And then we had a few survivors we talked to. And again, so when it relates to the model, Ruth, it kind of brings in those practitioner voices and those survivor voices. And I think again, that's reflective of the model and the work of the Institute itself, which is really that collaborative kind of lens and that looking at voices of practitioners and voices of survivors as being so important. And
Mm-hmm.
the last thing I'll say about how I see this fitting in is we really want this book to be a systems change tool and an implementation tool. So we're really hoping that organizations engage it, that they we'll talk at the end about sort of book groups that you can do, that people added to how they engage the institute. So they may do core training, but then get books for their staff. You know, I remember being struck years ago by how an agency bought implemented signs of safety, you know, as a child protection model, and bought the signs of safety book for their staff. And I think that's a logical thing to do here
Mm-hmm.
again for Safer Together implementation. And that people share it with social work schools and policymakers. You know, I hope this is a tool of influence in education, and in a way that's much more complete than maybe one of our white papers or other things are, but really kind of says, hey, here's 5, 6, 7, 8 sectors that kind of get touched by the model, you know, particularly kind of, you know, 6 of them really with the myths. And let's talk about this common framework. Let's talk about this paradigm shifts. Let's talk about this transformation,
Mm-hmm.
and not and break down some of the siloing that is so harmful to effective practice with families and outcomes with families. And so in some ways, I see this as a silo busting tool as well.
Right. Well, I'm amazed by the high level view. Um, there are a lot of people in the field who have their unique perspective because of the specific angle they work at, or the specific type of advocacy or perpetrator work they do. It's very rare to have a book that's able to dial up and see the whole field and how things are working together, and saying, when we're siloed in this way, we're actually doing a disservice to families because we're not all achieving the same goal together. So I love the myth busting and the de-siloing view of this book. Just as in, I always say, my former experience, medical practice, where the medical field had to learn that siloing was a danger to their end client. Siloing is a danger to families when we're all doing different actions and we're not speaking to each other. So getting people to understand from the different sectors what's happening in other sectors once they move a person along is really important to the holistic experience of a family and supporting them when there is violence within the home. And so I'm really proud of you for your high level view. And I think it's one of the unique things about the Safe and Together Institute is that we don't work in a singular sector. We work across all sectors to improve outcomes for the families and make them more safe in an efficient, effective, ethical way to increase that safety, permanency, and well-being through all of the actions that we're doing as professionals. So I have a quote up here from Dr. Kathy Humphreys, and some of you may know of her. She is a researcher, very well known. She's in Australia now, but has been a researcher in the UK. And this is one of the quotes from her review of the book. So I want to move along now, actually, from my questions to giving you an opportunity to talk about, um, some short excerpts, to read some short excerpts and then reflect on them a little bit. And I'm just going to throw this QR code up here. If anybody in the room has not yet purchased the book or seen the book on Amazon or on other platforms, you can purchase via this QR code. So, David, do you have an excerpt you want to read for us today?
Yeah, I have a few. We'll see how much time we have. And you know, I really just wanted to acknowledge that not only is Kathy provided a testimony about the book, but she also wrote the foreword and really endorsed it. And you know, that the book is really connected up to the larger field of folks who've come before, who are out there now, whether it's referencing the work of Emma Katz or Evan Stark, or, you know, Radford and Hester talk about sort of the 3-planet model that some of you are aware of, and sort of was really inspirational to me, and I referenced it in there. I see their work as really validating, because one of the things they said was that systems really kind of expect different things from survivors, and until we really tackle the kind of differing gender expectations of mothers and fathers, nothing, that we won't see a real paradigm shift. And so really kind of anchor the book in some ways in that perspective, which is that while each system has its unique place and needs, there is a shared challenge around differing gender expectations of men and women as parents. And that's really reflected in the title. And the first thing I wanted to read, Ruth, is out of the introduction, because there was a discussion about this wasn't the original title. And there was a lot of workshopping, and I really appreciated the feedback I got from lots of different folks about original title version, and really happy where it landed. And what I'll just say is want people to notice that the main title doesn't include the word domestic violence survivors or perpetrators, but it really talks about mothers and fathers, right? So this excerpt really speaks to that in the introduction. So the heading is why a focus on mothers as victims and fathers as perpetrators. This book title speaks to a tight focus on domestic violence perpetrated by fathers. See the glossary for the inclusive definition of fathers against mothers. However, the Safer Together model doesn't just apply to heterosexual couples or the most common scenario of male perpetrator and female victim. The model's pattern-based behavioral approach has proven useful in every possible relationship scenario, including female perpetrator against male victim, same-sex relationships, and instances when one or both of the partners are trans or non-binary. The model recognizes that men, women, trans, and non-binary people can be violent and controlling. Domestic violence occurs in same-sex and straight relationships, nor does the model fail to recognize that women can and do perpetrate child abuse and neglect. At the same time, gender-neutral language when discussing domestic violence in children glosses over crucial facts. While the declaration that all lives matters is true, it also doesn't capture the critical reality, unique dynamics of structural racism and targeted violence directed at Black lives. Similarly, a gender-neutral, sexual orientation-neutral, all victims matters approach does not equip us with the tools to challenge the structural dynamics of gender-based violence and the gender bias of our current system's dominant response to domestic violence in children. A response where the behaviors of fathers who choose coercive control are often ignored or minimized, and the mothers who are working hard to parent and protect in the context of those behaviors are blamed. So I'll stop there. And I really thought it'd be important to read that, Ruth, because one, it relates back to the choice of the title.
Right.
But it also really speaks to this core piece of thinking, which is we can have a both and approach. And later in the book, I relate this back to sort of light being a wave and a particle. Like we're smart enough to sort of have a both and approach to the issue of domestic violence, to really understand the ways it's gendered and the ways that it's universal. And the model does that. And I wanted to kind of really put a pin in that at the beginning of the book and say, and this book is about the gendered part of it.
Right.
And
Well, at the same
kind of
time,
speak to that.
you do say in the book that when we ignore fathers, we also ignore the fathers who are doing a good job. We also ignore the fathers who are succeeding in their role of parenting, because we're not able to look at their behavioral patterns. So, the behavioral focus of the model
Right,
is really the crux of the
right,
model. And
right,
understanding how behaviors arise in the contexts of not seeing people for their contributions or assuming that one person is supposed to be more safe than another parent because of their gender is actually the crux of the problem.
and what I'll say is that in a lot of instances, the Safer Together model is one of the biggest kind of proponents or drivers of father inclusive practice in child serving agencies, that often there's no other effort in that direction. And what I really want to say is that it's we need to be doing more, because when we don't do father inclusive practice overall, we're not being fair to men, women, and children, to the entire family, to communities. But we're not being fair to communities that where men have been targeted by racism or colonization.
Hmm.
We've gotten a really positive response from First Nation communities, particularly in Australia, for our talking about perpetrators as parents, because it's more holistic than just seeing people as criminal offenders.
Right.
Um, and I think people who don't take the time to really understand this perspective, um, really the working in this space over years, uh, kind of helped me reverse engineer that part of the problem is that it's not just that we don't do good work with violent men, we don't do good work with fathers in general. And so in some ways, the gap around working with violent fathers is a very specialized subset of that problem.
Hmm.
And if we're really going to make a real change, we need to be asking all fathers about how they support their partner's parenting in whatever relationship they're in. We need to get more comfortable male parental development. We need to be really thinking about, um, do we know how to talk to a dad about when he learned he was going to be a father for the first time, and how he felt and who he talked to, and how was he leading up to the birth of his child. And I mean, just these really simple things that should be basic skills if we're engaging families, that not only would help us work with all families, but would make us feel more confident working with men who choose violence.
Hmm.
So for me, this is the differing standards around mothers and fathers is so central to the paradigm shift we should be doing with families in general, but particularly around domestic violence.
Right. Well, I think you have another quote that you want to read from the book, right?
Yeah, I do, and it's along the same lines, because a lot of the book is on the same lines, and it's out of the chapter on the myth of parental alienation, and this was one of the more interesting chapters to write, because it's one of these, as many people probably who are here, is one of the more charged areas of discussion in the field. And this is not directly in the quote, but it's in the chapter. Really simply said, the myth of parental alienation is all the places where people try to apply it in cases where domestic violence exists or is alleged. The very definition of parental, whether you agree with it or not, whether you think the term should exist or not, whether you have your opinion about where it should be applied and where it shouldn't be applied, I actually don't address that. I don't question actually the concept of parental alienation in this book. What I do say is that the myth is when it's applied in cases where there's domestic violence. That's the problem I'm talking about, because there's nothing about the definition of parental alienation as it's agreed upon by many people that suggests it should be used in those cases. And generally it's understood as it's the thing that's left over to consider when every other reason for understanding why a child may not want to have contact with a parent has been explored. And it also assumes a prior good relationship between that parent and the child. And so you can begin to see the outlines about why in domestic violence cases. In fact, I had an leading expert in Australia, say to me that even when there's a suspicion of child abuse and neglect, parental alienation shouldn't be considered. And so when you get people who are really focused on this issue and this intersection, they understand what I'm talking about, is that the misapplication, we're talking about the misapplication or the myth application, if I'm going to be, kind of playful with words here, is the problem that I'm looking at. And I want people to really feel confident and comfortable saying, wait a second, I don't need to get into a debate about whether parental alienation exists or not, or that whether the origin of the term is tainted because of who created it. I just want to be able to argue that it's used by perpetrators in situations where domestic violence is documented should be thrown out.
Right.
Because until we really explore the impact of that on kids and the relationship, because we can see that of course that there's a good chance that somebody who's perpetrated domestic violence, that their behavior will have impacted their child's feelings about that. But I think in the context of the gender expectations, that we see this quick movement to blaming mothers usually, and saying that there's and giving traction to the alienation claim of perpetrators. So I'm going to read about that.
Mhm.
And so it's from a section in the Myth of Parental Alienation called Gender and Parental Alienation. And so it starts with low expectations for men as parents, a corollary to misogynistic attitude towards mothers, operate as both a sword and a shield for men who are perpetrators. Low expectations shield men's parenting from close scrutiny. And more broadly, the same applies to the implications of their life choices for their children. While women's choices, from her meal preparation to employment and relationship choices, are part of the cultural scorecard of our parenting, men's value to their children is often primarily viewed through the lens of his role as a breadwinner. This means that the rest of his behaviors, which can have a profound influence on the day-to-day functioning of his partner, his children, his family, often fall outside the sphere of meaningful professional scrutiny. And even when his behaviors are examined, they're given different weight and meaning. They are considered less central to the children's emotional and physical needs and less central to their healthy development. The minimization of men's parenting and life choices is cumulative over the life of a case and challenging to identify because it is about what is absent or missing, not what is present. The information about his parenting and its impact is often not developed in the first place. Professionals ask fewer questions about his role in the family, and therefore this information is never fully documented or factored into reports or other sources of information presented to a court. For example, I regularly ask professionals working with children who are on some form of psychotropic medications if they know whether the fathers, any fathers, not just violent fathers, were in favor or against the medication regimen. The majority had no idea if the father was supportive of, opposed to, or neutral about his child taking this medication. How could his role in the therapeutic success or his role in the failure of his child even be assessed if the question was not even considered? Whether a father is actively involved with his child's mental health treatment or not is not the point. The point is that professionals don't even consider the question of his involvement to be relevant. Even his lack of involvement in his own child's treatment should be considered relevant, important information for any discussion regarding parenting time and custody. So part of what I want people to take away from here is just that the struggle here is about what is absent, what is not developed, and the cumulative nature. So again, what I want people to be able to do is to see deeply into that when they're and this all funnels towards child protection systems, particularly family courts as well, that they're drawing on multiple experts and multiple data points, whether it's a private therapist or an evaluator or a child protection file or a police report, and the invisibility of the father's responsibility or harm to kids and the impact of behavior on kids functioning is invisible or missing at every step along the way. And that gets compounded. And I use cumulative, but can use the word compounded so that when it shows up in court, you can begin to understand why survivors feel crazy that for them, the effect is so apparent. For the kids, the effect is so apparent. But in the official permanent record, it's invisible or it's so downplayed. And that's the idea of the myth. The myth is we think we're actually identifying something, but we're not.
Right, right.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me that the whole basis of the legal system is that there is supposed to be a realm where we are equal in the eyes of the law, and we're being equally considered in the eyes of the law. And all you're really asking is that people equally consider
Right.
the contribution of both parents, regardless of whether they're male or female, or whatever their gender identity is, to the children, to the well-being of children. And that's a very, very basic
Right.
thing that's very protective
Right.
of the family structure. And one would think that if we do want to improve child safety and well-being, if we do want to assist families in being healthy as families together, that we would do those actions.
Right.
So it's kind of crazy making that people don't want to do that.
Well, I think your point about equal in front of the law and the failure to protect chapter, the myth of failure to protect, where I talk about sort of how that concept is and I speak about this in a bunch of different places. While on paper, a lot of these things are gender neutral, that in practice, both parental alienation but also failure to protect as a concept and then maybe as a child maltreatment or a criminal charge, on paper they're gender neutral. But in practice they're not. They're very gendered in their application. And so I talk about failure to protect culture and my experience of that, that if you look at, again, child protection is where the model started, but you look at child protection, it's everybody who's familiar with that system, and there's been a lot of academic writing about this, will talk about how gendered that system is and how focused it is on fathers. And Kathy wrote about this, about 100 years of mother blaming and ignoring fathers in child protection practice, and but if you look, you don't see gendered language in the formal policies and the instructions and the legislation, but it's everywhere. And it's customs and practices and belief systems. So that's why I refer to it as failure to protect culture in the book, because I think we really need to understand the culture that is gendered in these areas, because very, little bit is necessarily written down or explicit, but it's built into every place where it says, well, look at the primary caregiver and tools that give weight to the primary caregiver, in most cases, usually the mom, and doesn't really ask the same questions about for instance, the background of the secondary caregiver, quote unquote. So those things are where this gender bias is structured into the tools, but it doesn't sort of come out and you say, well, look at the mother. It says primary caregiver, secondary caregiver, for instance. That would be an example of it. So you need to be able to break it down.
All right, we've had a couple of different quotes here, and I just want you to kind of talk a little bit more about the common language and framework that this book is trying to create across a lot of different sectors.
Mhm.
When we work with different regions, we often work with child protection, we work with family law, we work with judicial and law enforcement, and we also work with child and family services and with advocates and with mental health practitioners. So we're really touching on a tremendous amount of different sectors and practices that all have their own frameworks. They all have their own mandates. They all have very rigid environments that they're operating within. And the thing that really amazed me when I first met you and first started talking to you about what you were doing was that you would be able to bring all of these different people together, that they were able to really see the sense and rationale of what you were doing, not just how it was able to identify who the parent who was causing danger and harm to the family cohesion, to child well-being was,
Right.
but also able to identify very concrete ways to work with those families
Right.
to improve the parenting of both parents, to improve the collaboration, to improve child well-being and safety ultimately at the end of the day, and to identify where one parent was unwilling to change their behaviors and was going to potentially continue to present danger and dysfunction to the family. So, I want you to talk about that common language
Sure.
framework because it's very powerful.
Sure. And I can do that. And I'd love to see what questions are after that are coming from the audience. I think Ruth, as I think about it, I go back to a little bit about the origins of the model. One is somebody who started out working with perpetrators, but in a victim-centered way. My work has always been integrative. I think a lot of our service systems are siloed, and therefore people, work with one population, survivors or perpetrators or children. And that there may not be a big expectation in that service delivery that they're integrative in their thinking, and that they're often focused on meeting the needs of the person in front of them. And I actually had to start, and anybody does good perpetrator work, while it was the perpetrator sitting in front of me, I had to be thinking about the survivor all the time, right? So I had to think, kind of connectively. And then, the model as it arose was part of work with multiple systems, child protection at that point, and women's sector together. And the model really developed this idea that it had to be, in my mind, meet the need. It had to be a child protection focused model, serve the needs of child protection. So it had to help the workers do their job. I was very much, as a practitioner, very much focused on not theory, not ideas of like jargon, perpetrator accountability, but how do I, as a practitioner, help other practitioners interview somebody who's a perpetrator or partner with a survivor ultimately, and do it in a way that helped them accomplish their mission, right? So it was always about that, but in a way that also would make sense to survivors, better their outcomes, and therefore make sense to advocates. So really the model was always built around this idea of bringing the work together, and in some sense, it was like, how do you land DV knowledge and expertise inside a child protection framework? So there was always this integrative at each of these levels, this integrative kind of breaking down silos thinking. And then it just from there kind of it expanded as the work expanded to really thinking about how does this affect mental health practitioners, because child protection is interacting with mental health practitioners, and I could see the gaps in what they were providing or not providing. So even if they were trauma informed, they might not be talking about parenting strengths of survivors, or as an adult practitioner, they might not be talking about the quality of, they might be reticent. I would see, wow, they don't want to talk about her parenting, even though the court wants feedback on her parenting. They're seeing themselves as treating her trauma. And therefore, there's nobody telling the court that she's a great parent. So it was kind of looking at as sort of where the model took us in terms of the gaps, or how perpetrators weren't being addressed in substance use programs, even though we could say that a lot of domestic violence perpetrators have substance use issues, that those folks weren't being skilled up and therefore were easily manipulated and not addressing it and not part of the accountability web for perpetrators. So I think there was a natural evolution, Ruth, over time until now. We see it embedded in the mapping tool. We see the mapping tool. I just recently did some great with Jackie Ruck, our regional manager from Australia, some really exciting multi-agency sessions where juvenile justice was there, and child protection, and therapists. And they used the mapping tool, and they said, we didn't realize we had so much shared information about this family, and the mapping tool gave them a way to bring them together.
Yeah.
Um, so
It's great.
anyway, so there's a lot. It's one of the things I get most excited about right now is the common language, common framework
Mhm.
value, that more people use it in an agency, the more people use it in community, the more we believe it will accelerate the paradigm shift. So it's actually about numbers as
Mhm.
well as just sort of who used it, but as many people using this as possible, we think really shifts creates more speed and power in the shift and the transformation.
So, do you want to take a few questions from people? Are you ready for that?
Jacob, do we have the Q&A set up so people can drop questions in?
We don't, but we can activate the chat and people can drop it in there if you'd like.
That'd be great.
Let's do that. Um, so I just wanted to sort of piggyback again, and repetition sometimes, really helps me to sort of understand and land things. But, You know, again, this is a very behaviorally based look at both practice and the way that we're applying the mandates and laws and policies and practice-based ways that we engage with families. And it is a way that looks at a high level across lots of different sectors at how we're actually achieving what we say we want to achieve, which is child well-being and safety, permanency, self-determination, stability, all of those different things. Um, and it's a really, really good way to, if you're a practitioner who's working within a specific area with families, to sort of dial back the lens and understand the limitations and the challenges of practitioners around you that you may be referring families to. You may have the best practice in the world. You may look at people's parenting from a behaviorally based way and work really well with families. But that doesn't mean when you're passing a family along to mental health services, or when they engage with family courts, or when they engage with child protection, that that practice is good. So you having the awareness of knowledge about what people are experiencing in other sectors when domestic violence and child well-being is a question is actually very pertinent to you being successful as a practitioner.
Ruth, I want to talk about this slide as we're waiting for some questions to come up, but what you're making me think about is people giving the book when they make a referral to somebody. I'm
Yeah.
making a referral to a client, and here's a book for you to read while you're when you see them. But just a couple of things about what you can do to support the book. One is obviously, if you haven't purchased it, we hope you purchase it. Those QR codes are up and on every page. And so you can scan that in off your phone, and it takes you right to the correct Amazon page for you, and you can purchase either a Kindle version, a hardcover, or a soft cover. Hardcover has all the cartoons and comics and that are in there, and I didn't even talk about that, Ruth. About how the book is designed with very accessible kind of examples of practice and the myths in graphic design, and there's lots of graphic elements to the book. It's easy to read. It's got kind of quotes throughout it. So we really designed it so it's easy in the eyes and really accessible. But so you can do Kindle, softcover, hardcover. We hope you buy it. We hope you write a review on Amazon if you buy it. Again, that's not up there, but really the reviews really, will drive other people being interested in buying the book. Consider it as a bulk purchase for your agency. Again, the softcover book, is a great way. It's very accessible at about $19.95 US dollars. See who should get it at your agency, and for orders over 20, you get a 10% discount. And you have to go to our website to do the bulk ordering. Host a book reading group at work, or in your community, a multi-agency team. And we're going to have a guide coming soon, but don't wait for that. Buy the book, say, let's read it all by April 15th, and then get together and talk about it. I think, again, power in numbers and, ability to get people thinking together and talking about the ideas. And they may agree, they may disagree. Ask your local library and bookstore to carry a copy. That's just a very common way to get the book out there to people who might not find it any other way. We're really interested in this, and if you have ideas or thoughts about it, I'm getting asked by social work professors for copies, review copies. We're happy to send out review copies to anybody who'd be considering it, teaching it in their courses. We've been wanting to get into social work undergraduate and graduate programs for years. This is a way to do it. So again, any ideas you have about doing that, please reach out to us, or get us the name of somebody you think would want it, or buy them a copy. Share the book with any media, people who do podcasts, newspapers, magazines, who might want to review the book or interview me. We're really, I've already done one podcast about the book. I'm about to do another one, being interviewed on a podcast. We're really excited about getting the word out. And then, buy and send copies to legislators and other influential persons, which is, we're going to be sending it to there's a fatherhood caucus in Congress, of the United States. We're going to be sending to people there. Just think about if you're a champion for this kind of paradigm shift, think about how you can use this book as a tool of influence in education. And so again, figure it out, reach out to us for ideas, talk to us, take steps. And so I'm really excited to kind of hear from people what they do and what can happen. So
And I have sort of a ending question that was not on your list of questions.
sure.
What do you hope that this book will achieve in the wider field?
I'll be honest, I'm really tired of how little progress we've made. I mean, I've been in the field 35 years. I'm really tired of the lack of progress in many ways we've made around the work with fathers. And so I really really hope that it does shift the paradigm around that and really open up both a more specific conversation about fathers who use violence in their families, but also a wider conversation about fathers uh and how we really are doing a disservice to families and communities by being so poorly skilled. We don't work with the entire family. We don't, anywhere we work with families, quote unquote, we're often just working with mothers and children. And I think we just need to be honest with ourselves about that.
Right.
And then the corollary is I really feel like we're doing, as part of this, and this is why it's kind of connected, at the same time we're doing a disservice to mothers who are working hard, which is not every mother, who are working hard to protect their kids. And those efforts are being ignored or being undervalued because it's just what we expect moms to do. And just, in the book, in my work, there's just stories where people, I remember the social work supervisor said to me, if that was my kid, I'd jump out of this second story burning building to save my kid. There's this sense of, unless you're willing to be seen actively putting your life in jeopardy, like throwing your body in front of a bullet, that unless you're doing that as a mom, that everything else is expected, and even that's expected. And so the getting up after you've been assaulted to cook the kids meals, to the making sure that they're seeing extended family, the keeping the kid on track with schools in the context of domestic violence, even though it's harder and you're dealing with your own trauma and your own depression, and the kids are more complex now because they're angry and they're having behavioral issues. I think we just are not doing right by families, by moms, by kids, by not, and it's not that hard to say, I see how hard you're working to keep your kids on track. That doesn't mean nothing needs to be fixed. It doesn't mean that there's not problem. It doesn't mean there's not danger. But just to be able to say to a survivor, oh my God, so you're telling me after he assaulted you the other night, you still got up at 5:30, made the kids food, made sure they got on the bus. I just want to tell you that I see that. And that's I really appreciate it. I think that matters a lot to your kids. It may not feel like enough to you, but I want to make sure that I'm going to document that you haven't lost sight of your kids' needs in the midst of what's happening to you. And to me, that's my vision of what we need to be doing. And that means she's less likely to be manipulated by the perpetrator, that she actually, it's a true definition of empowerment and support. And that means that as that person moves through the system, they're going to carry with them documentation that says, these are the ways I've been a good mother. And that's going to give them more confidence to face systems and give more information for decision makers to say, yeah, this isn't parental alienation. This is somebody sticking up for their kids and trying to make sure they're okay. I want all that.
Right.
And I hope this book helps accomplish that.
Well, I think that's a great way to end our book launch for North America and Europe. And I love the title of the book, because if we immediately blame one parent and ignore another parent, we're not doing our jobs of behaviorally assessing who is the parent that is causing danger and harm and instability to the family. And so it really fits with the ethos, the values of the safe and together model, which seeks to help families and children live safely together, which is our goal, to keep families and children safe and together, and assist in material and concrete ways which improve the safety, permanency, and well-being and self-determination of the people living in those families, and to really truly support those families to be healthy. I can't see how anyone would have a problem with any of that unless there's somebody who wants to truly just enforce control and wants to continue behaviors which are harmful and which destroy the family well-being and family cohesion. So I love the title, and I'm really proud of you. I've walked this journey with you while you wrote this book, and as a survivor of child abuse, and very knowledgeable about female perpetrators as well, I wholeheartedly put my stamp of approval on this book. So
And
thank
thank
you
you,
for your
Ruth.
words.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for your support as it went through the writing process, and thank you to everybody at the Institute
Yeah.
who is, carrying the water on this. Thank you to Deb Nicholson, and also my team of folks,
Yeah.
Owele Amelia, who did the graphics, and everybody at My Word Publishing who sort of coached us through the self-publishing process, and Amanda Miller particularly. Just want to just kind of get that out there. Thank you to all those folks who were really really instrumental in making this book possible.
So that's the end of our book launch,
Thank you,
people. Thanks
everybody.
for attending. I hope you got the QR code. Get out there, read the books, bust some myths, and let's change some things.
All right. Thank you all.
Take care.